All right, welcome everybody to the theme panel at the UU at UN Spring Seminar theme panel. We consider this one of the most important panels of the seminar, so we hope you really enjoy it. We have three absolutely wonderful speakers that are very knowledgeable of this whole issue of climate-forced displacement. Just as an introduction, I should point out that international refugee law and also US refugee law does not make adequate account for climate-forced refugees. If you are forced to be a refugee, to leave your home and to come to the United States or any other country, because of climate, refugee law isn't very well suited to help you. And I think our speakers will probably talk to that. We're going to start with Salote Soqo. She's the director of global displacement, she's the director of advocacy and global displacement. Salote leads the strengthened UUSC advocacy framework. She has done extensive work in the Pacific Islands and coastal communities in the United States. Before joining UUSC, Salote worked as a regional program coordinator in the Water Equity and Climate Justice for the Environmental Justice Coalition for Water, EJCW. She was also the Climate and Carbon Management Fellow with the EJCW and the Carbon Cycle Institute. Prior to that, she worked as an environmental consultant in Fiji. Salote attained her undergraduate degrees from Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand and the University of the South Pacific in Fiji. She also holds a master's degree in environmental management from the University of San Francisco. Please welcome Salote Soqo.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Everyone, it's so wonderful to be here today and to be on this panel with Amali, who I've had the pleasure of being in a few spaces, and lovely to be with Noella, who I'm looking forward to hearing from this evening. As Bruce mentioned, my name is Salote Soqo, and my ancestors are from Takonrobe and from Lau in Fiji, and I am calling today from the indigenous territories of the Nipmuc people in central Massachusetts, and I acknowledge the enduring relationship and stewardship between the Nipmuc and the indigenous territories. I work for the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, an international human rights organization whose mission is to advance human rights and social justice around the world, partnering with those who confront unjust power structures and mobilizing to challenge oppressive policies. Our work is grounded in the belief that all people have inherent power and dignity. And throughout our work, we found that climate-forced displacement, the manifestation of climate inaction, or failed climate mitigation or failed climate adaptation of rapid loss and damage, and climate injustice at its core strips away people's human rights. It robs people of their human dignities, not only when they are forced to leave their homes and everything that they know behind, but when they are forced to do so without any say-so, and when people who are most affected by these issues are being neglected when it comes to problem solving the issue. And as you can imagine, this isn't only frustrating, it's also deeply unfair and immoral. And these are the issues that our partners in the Pacific Islands and here in the United States are experiencing today. And I want to spend the rest of my time just going deeper into some of the impacts that we're learning from our partners, because I feel that we cannot describe them enough to describe why it's important and to continue to advocate about the importance of why we need to center their voices and their leadership on this issue, which is the cornerstone of UUSC's advocacy. UUSC partners with communities who are losing their homes due to a number of climate change impacts. In the Pacific, we partner with grassroots communities in Tuvalu, in Kiribati, in the Marshall Islands, who are facing flooding from sea level rise and king tides that are inundating their homes and food gardens and drinking water supplies. In Fiji, in the Solomon Islands, and in Papua New Guinea, we partner with communities who are actively looking for land to relocate to and for food to feed households who are unable to grow crops anymore. In the Carteret Islands in Papua New Guinea, just last year, it started from the year before in 2020, children under the age of 6 were suffering from malnutrition because the the islands couldn't grow any more food and travel between the islands were restricted due to COVID-19. This was also the case for some outer islands in Tuvalu. Now, as we know, the Pacific emits less than 5% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, and they're experiencing the disproportionate effects of the climate crisis. And the pandemic has exposed some of the vulnerabilities that countries have in responding to the impacts that they're already seeing, such as the case in Papua New Guinea and Tuvalu, but it's also exacerbating some of these existing issues. In Louisiana, in the United States, UUSC partners with tribes who live along the edge of the Mississippi River Delta, and they're losing their ancestral lands due to a number of issues, including sea level rise. The area where they live is known to lose, now I want to make sure that I get this correct, wetlands that is the size of a football field every 100 minutes. That is a lot of land to lose. During Hurricane Ida last year, homes that had already been made vulnerable by repeated hurricanes and gradual sea level rise in the bayou were completely destroyed. And today, many families are still living without homes and searching for a place to live. Many tribes that we partner with have lost burial sites due to rising seas. They're experiencing loss of subsistence. Many tribes rely on oyster farming in the areas where they live for food and income. Land erosion is threatening their houses and the safety of their families. In Alaska, permafrost melt, land erosion, and frequently strong storms are threatening the habitability of many Alaska Native communities. In 2009, the United States Government Accountability Office identified several communities that needed to be relocated. Yet today, in 2022, many of the same communities are still living where they were back then. Permafrost is the inch-thick slab of ice that forms underneath the ground in the Arctic that stabilizes land and allows infrastructure to be built upon it. And because it's melting, land is collapsing and everything that is on it is falling. So melting permafrost it's not only an environmental catastrophe, it's very hazardous for wildlife and causes a public health issue for many populations who live in these environments. So those are some of the key issues that are happening in many of the communities that UUSC partners with and supports. There is no framework, legal framework, policy framework to assist communities who wish to relocate to safety today. There are a few countries in the Pacific that are developing policies for internal relocation at the national level. I believe Fiji, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu are 3 of those countries. In the United States, there's a relocation policy to help entire communities like the ones in Louisiana and Alaska to relocate safely before a climate catastrophe occurs. But we're optimistic. We recognize that this is an opportunity to create one that is centered in human rights and one that learns from the past. Many of the tribes and the indigenous peoples we work with carry with them living stories of their ancestors and being displaced historically through genocide of their people, colonialism, racism. And we recognize that climate change is a manifestation of the entrenched violence of colonialism and racism on Mother Earth and on our bodies. That is the deep lesson that indigenous tribes have taught us at UUSC. And we need to consider this in our response. We can't just learn that and then not show it in our advocacy. And so what would this look like? Centering human rights in policy, language justice, being mindful of the language that we use in our advocacy, in policy, whether that's at the national or international level, gender-based policies that takes into consideration the role of women, the gendered impacts of climate change and climate-forced displacement, participatory inclusive engagement in legislative processes and budgeting, the disaggregation of data based on gender and race and sexual orientation, the localization of multilateral international frameworks, all this juicy stuff. And these are some elements of a rights-based response and what that looks like. But it starts with first recognizing and honoring those on the front lines and their experiences and the knowledge and wisdom that they hold in providing solutions. So I'll stop there and thank you, Bruce. I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was a very deep conversation. You've taught us a lot. Our next speaker is Noella Prescott. And before I go into her regular introduction, she's a dean. She's on the planning committee. She was on the planning committee last year. I don't know how many years you've been on the planning committee, but the success of this seminar and the last one, a lot of it goes to Noella. She's just been absolutely superb in giving us leadership and guidance from a youth perspective. So thank you, first of all, for all the work you've done. And I'm glad you're here to tell us about your experiences. Noella is a Canadian youth who is passionate about climate justice and anti-racism work and dance. She's also one of the youth deans of this seminar, as I just said. She tries to approach her social justice work with a lens of intersectionality and hopes to make the world a better place for future generations. She's a resident of British Columbia, which, by the way, is where my husband and I were married, in British Columbia. Noella has come face to face with the impacts of climate change, from extreme heat waves to forest fires in the summer and flooding and mudslides in the winter. Every summer, thousands of BC residents are forced to evacuate their towns, and many homes are completely destroyed due to forest fires. Noella is excited to share her thoughts on climate justice and learn from other perspectives. Welcome, Noella.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. Again, my name is Noella and I use she, they pronouns, and I am on the traditional, unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. First of all, I just wanted to say that I don't really consider myself an expert on these topics. I'm still definitely learning a lot, but I just feel I'm really lucky to be here and speak alongside Amali and Salote and get to listen to and learn from them as well. And I also want to say that I have not personally experienced climate-forced displacement, but I'll just be coming from a place of speaking about my own personal experiences and what I've learned from research about the events that have taken place around me as a resident of British Columbia. The first summer that I remember being made aware of the BC forest fires, or like any climate change related emergency anywhere near me, was probably 2017. And I was only 11 at the time, and I was away for most of the summer. So all I really thought it was kind of like I had to cancel certain activities on our road trip, and all my friends complained, oh, it was so smoky while you were gone. But I didn't really get the full impact of it. But over the next few summers, I gradually began to understand that the forest fires were kind of a part of BC life, and it was happening every year. And I just saw them on the news every year that there was burning towns like in my province. And even though I logically knew that the forest fires were in my province, this was happening close to me, I still felt like they were happening somewhere very, very far away. And I think a lot of people have this perspective that climate change is always happening somewhere else to someone else and somewhere very far away sometime in the future. But I think that's just kind of a way of protecting ourselves from the dangers, kind of like imagining there's this barrier between yourself and all these very dangerous issues. As extreme weather and climate events have begun to cause direct repercussions in my community and communities near me, I've been forced to rethink this imaginary barrier that I tried to put between myself and these disasters. My friends and I used to make jokes, and we'd complain about the summer day, how hot it was. Then we'd be like, oh, I guess it's climate change, and laugh about it. But we never thought that those hot days would turn into such a serious issue. With a death toll of about 600 people and over 1 billion sea mammals, the June heatwave of 2021 is an event that some people consider to be the deadliest weather event in Canada's history. Here in Vancouver, we reached highs of over 40 degrees Celsius or 105 degrees Fahrenheit, but some other places in the interior got to record-breaking temperatures such as nearly 50 degrees Celsius or 122 degrees Fahrenheit. These were incredibly dangerous temperatures considering that pretty much no one in BC has any easy means of cooling down, such as having a pool or having air conditioning their house. No one really has that here. So it's really dangerous, and for a lot of people, there's no escape from the heat. For myself, all day I felt like I would pass out, but felt like I was really lucky to have options. I would take cold showers and have ice water, and I was able to get transportation to the beach in order to stay safe. But I know that not everyone had options like that, and it's really terrifying to think that this kind of extreme temperatures may no longer be a once-in-a-lifetime or a freak incident. Is this going to happen every year? Are there going to be death rates this high every year? And is there nothing we can do to stop this? Well, one thing that I think really needs to happen is for the government to understand that unusual weather events are starting to occur more and more often. We need action plans for stuff like this. For example, there could have been more places that provided safety and protection from the extreme heat, especially for people who cannot afford any means of cooling their house down or don't even have a house to go back to. There should be warnings and preparation guides before the heat wave even strikes so that people aren't left confused and panicking when the temperatures soar and they have no plan or supplies to stay cool. After that summer ended and the forest fires that happen every year died down and all that was over, I thought that would kind of just be the end of the extreme weather events in BC, at least for that year. But in November 2021, intense rains poured down, leading to flooding, mudslides, and several deaths. Honestly, I never thought that the city nicknamed Raincouver would one day have more rain than it knew how to deal with, but that's the reality of climate change-related weather extremes. They're really extreme. The BC flooding was once again one of the most devastating climate disasters around the world in 2021. Mudslides blocked highways that were the transport path between Vancouver and the rest of Canada. Hundreds of thousands of livestock died, and nearly 15,000 people had to leave their homes and were displaced. I'm incredibly grateful that my house was mainly unharmed other than my garage, but I can't even imagine how hard it would be to have to evacuate your home and then find your community a complete mess when you return. From fires to floods to everything in between, climate change-related weather events destroy homes, jobs, and lives. So how can people be prepared for floods? Again, I think making an emergency plan is crucial. Do you know the most likely area of your house to flood, and what's in that place that would be destroyed if water would get in? What things would you want to take with you if you have to evacuate? Who around you in your community might need extra help if flooding started? The time to think about all these things is now, before there's an emergency. For me as a youth, this is the future that I'm coming into. It's terrifying to imagine that years like 2021 might not be seen as once in a lifetime sometime in the future. I wish that generations to come could inherit a thriving Earth, or at least an Earth where we knew how to deal with and prepare with the emergencies that come with climate change. But honestly, amidst all this, the Canadian government is still contributing to climate change in so many ways. Right now, they're still trying to push their Trans Mountain pipeline through British Columbia, ignoring protests from local activists and Indigenous communities who will be directly impacted by the pipeline. It honestly feels like the Canadian government has not learned anything from all that has happened, and if that hasn't taught them anything, what is going to be the turning point? Something that's important to remember in situations like this is that not everyone is going to be impacted equally. As I mentioned before, I feel really lucky that I happen to have the resources and be in a really good situation where I don't feel like I was in a lot of danger from these climate events, but there are many communities where these situations are very, very threatening. There are also a lot of inequities as to who is helped first, who is depicted in the media for these stories, and who is most affected in these events. Research shows that 32% of on-reserve First Nations communities in Canada are facing danger from forest fires, compared to about 12% of the general Canadian population. First Nation reserves are often remote and further north, so that, combined with the fact that there are so many easily flammable wildlife areas on many reserves, can create a very hazardous environment. While Indigenous people are more likely to feel the impacts of climate change, many of them are the ones speaking up and trying to protect the environment. And the corporations and the people with more privileges are benefiting from climate destructive processes, and they are not the ones facing the consequences as much. Along with that, Indigenous people are often more attached to the land. It's been their land for so many years, longer than settlers, and the evacuations can have a much greater emotional impact for them, especially when there's the threat of coming back to only ashes after the fires finally die down. It's really important to keep these inequities and different perspectives in mind when talking about climate displacement. There are also certain social and historical factors to keep in mind, such as some Indigenous people being rightly distrustful of colonial structures, like the RCMP trying to tell them to leave the land that they've been fighting to stay on for centuries. There needs to be practices, such as allowing First Nations people who live on reserves to stay as close to their homes as possible, even if they must be displaced, trying to keep the families and communities together when they're displaced so that they can continue practicing their community traditions, and just trying to be more understanding and empathetic to Indigenous people who might be extremely resistant to leaving their lives behind. And right now, I want you to take a second, maybe close your eyes, and just try to think about and visualize what it might be like for you to be forced to evacuate your home because of fires or floods. Think about days of extreme temperatures with no relief. Think about returning to your community after a hot summer and finding only ashes of what was once there. At least some of these things may one day be a reality for yourself or for someone you love. I know that it can be scary or exhausting to hear the realities of climate change, the reality of how many people have already died, the reality that the frequency of weather disasters is steadily increasing, the reality that many, many more people are going to die. But I think we do need to hear about this. As I said before, I myself was almost willingly blind to realities like this, even though it was happening so close to me. I always pictured it as happening far away. I always pictured it as foreign and in the future. But this past year of one emergency after the other has awakened me to the fact that at some point, all of us are going to have to prepare for climate-related emergencies that right now we have no idea how to deal with. If even Vancouver goes into panic from floods, how will places that have even less coping strategies for floods end up reacting? We need to know the realities so that we can all prepare and, very important, help each other to prepare. The thing is, rare weather extremes are becoming more and more common, and it's important to know that the realities of events that may one day be happening to you or to communities near you. Right now, just try and think of an extreme weather condition that your community will or may eventually have to face. What can you do today to prepare and keep everyone safe when the time comes? The time to prepare for emergencies is not in the middle of them, it's far before they even happen. And the more prepared you are, the more prepared you'll be to help others around you who may not have access to the same supplies and strategies that you do. Right now is the time to prepare, to notice who might be forgotten when effects of the climate emergency become apparent, and to take steps to prevent the climate crisis from developing any further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noella. And you really brought it home that climate forced displacement doesn't just happen in foreign places far, far away, that it can happen right in our own neighborhoods, and it does happen. The theme panel of the seminar is our way of trying to connect the seminar and the topics of the seminar to the United Nations. And our next speaker has spent a long time working with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. Her name is Amali Tower. She's also the founder and executive director of Climate Refugees. She has extensive global experience in refugee protection, refugees resettlement, and enforced migration and displacement contexts, having worked globally with numerous NGOs and the UNHCR and the US Refugee Admissions Program. Her research on climate, conflict, and displacement in the Lake Chad Basin and African Sahel was presented as evidence of loss and damage at COP26 in Glasgow. She sits on the advisory board of the Center for Climate and Security in Washington, D.C. She developed her work ethic, worldviews, and deep commitment to forcibly displaced populations through a lived experience of instability and as an immigrant, migrant, and even once an asylum seeker. She received her master's in international affairs focused on human rights from the School of International Public Affairs at Columbia University and has a BA in International Development Studies from UCLA, and she resides in New York City. And I do want to thank our intern, Amanda Newlove, for finding Amali for this session. So thank you very much, Amali Tower, for being here, and we're very eager to hear what you have to say. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bruce. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you to all of you, to the organizers, to Amanda, to Noella and Salote. It's an honor to share this conversation with you both and with Bruce. So as Bruce has said, what I'll do is to complement what both Salote and Noella have shared. I'll provide a landscape of where we stand and the global governance structure that provides some protection for people who are forcibly displaced by climate change, but certainly not enough, and why that is the case. But at the onset, let me be very clear that this is fundamentally, this is an issue of justice. And that's really what underpins the central problem, but also the central solutions and the ways forward. And I think it's really helpful if we think about it that way, because yes, there are a lot of problems, but but we also know what the solutions are. So it's really about a people's movement, and it's about collective will and finding that political will to do that. So there's a lot of talk about adaptation, that frontline communities need to adapt and climate migrants need to adapt, and that migration is a form of adaptation. And I would say that adaptation is not just for climate migrants and frontline communities. Today's crises that we're seeing play out, whether it be Afghanistan that happened last year and Ukraine as it is happening right now, are an opportunity for us to learn and adapt, to humanize migrants, because I think this has come to, the term migrant has even come to mean something quite, well, certainly lacking dignity, to adopt an international framework for migrants as much as we have one for refugees, and to understand the multi-causal forces that both push and pull migration today are increasingly a continuum of forced and survival situations where people with limited means are moving out of desperation and not necessarily always into better situations. So our international migration governance, I'll say as a whole, when it comes to refugees, we have the 1951 Refugee Convention, and the definition of a refugee is someone who has left their country and has crossed an international boundary and is seeking protection in another country and has a well-founded fear of persecution on the basis of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. That convention, it comes out of World War II, and at the time had a geographic limitation as well as a temporal limitation, meaning that it was really not supposed to last the 70+ years that we now still have. Both the mandate of UNHCR as well as this convention that still exists, right? It was also only supposed to apply to people that were coming out of Europe, but in 1967 we had an additional protocol because of the fact that, you know, our conditions of forced displacement have not only worsened, they've accelerated, they've changed, and now they've even gotten worse. We have since then, in 2015, we adopted what's called the Global Compact for Migration, the Global Compact for Refugees. Both are non-binding. The Global Compact for Migration, importantly, recognized that climate change was a situation that is forcing people to have to move, to have to migrate across international boundaries. Although it's a non-binding compact, it's not a convention, it was adopted by most UN states, and we do have in May the first review of this to sort of look at, you know, where have we come in terms of upholding some of the principles that were enshrined in it. Essentially, states agreed to provide the highest, you know, most robust standards of protection to migrants. But I think we can all see when we look at the Mediterranean basin, when we look at the US southern border, when we look at detention in Australia, when we look at what's going on in the UK with offshoring now with this agreement to basically send you asylum seekers in the UK to Rwanda. There are these sort of third-party agreements, and this is kind of the way it is today, where you're pushing back asylum seekers, where you're pushing back migrants, and I might say that, you know, since the adoption of the Global Compact for Migration, we haven't necessarily seen an increase in protection, but more likely circumventing some of the protections that are actually supposedly internationally legally sacrosanct. So when it comes to migrants, however, maybe it'll surprise people to know this, and when I speak to students, I do ask people to tell me what is the definition of a migrant. And a lot of people take a stab at it, but for the purpose of this webinar, let me just tell you that there is no definition for migrant. And that is because, well, we don't have one. We don't have an international framework for migrants. We have human rights treaties, we have human rights laws, and we have human rights that pertain to migrants, just as we do have human rights for everybody, but we do not have a definition for who and what, you know, constitutes a migrant. So in situations like climate change, where people are being forced to sort of like move for situations that you heard Salote describe and Noella describe, this is really where that sort of like juxtaposition and this tension now lies, because they don't fall under the Refugee Convention, and then yet we don't have a definition for migrant. And so what are they? Are they not asylum seekers, right? Who are trying to go to another country. They can't seek protection as a refugee because it's not one of the protected grounds. And yet a migrant also has no real protection. In fact, even though migrants have no definition, what by and large migrants are seen as moving for voluntary reasons. So could you say that what Noella and Salote described, you know, sound to you like situations of voluntary movement, rising seas, drought, crop failure, food insecurity, like you're seeing in Central America, and thus the migration of you know, now tens of thousands of Central Americans at the US southern border, which, you know, we saw those numbers come to the southern border when food insecurity was as high as almost 2 million people in the Central American dry corridor. And you do not get to those levels of food insecurity amongst a highly impoverished rural community of indigenous populations without 5, 6, 7, 8 years of drought and crop loss, which we know is also climate driven. So this is the context in which these things are happening. We have numerous IPCC reports now telling us what this looks like in different regions of the world, so much so that we know that by I'm going to get the date wrong, so I'm not going to take a stab at it, but we do know that Africa, you know, 700 million people could be displaced in the worst case scenario due to water scarcity by okay, let me take a stab at it. I think it's 2030. I'm going to forget those numbers, but it's chapter 9 of the latest IPCC report, if someone wants to look that up. You know, so the numbers are terrible, and the projections for how many people could be displaced are just that, projections. They're models. Nobody really knows. It's the inaction that is forcing people to have to move. And I would say far more than paying attention to projections, we should be paying attention to the alarming lack of protections. Let me also just sort of like move on here to say that 90% of the refugees today, refugees that do fall under that mandate convention, now come from countries that are vulnerable to climate change. We have, even before Ukraine, over 84 million people are forcibly displaced, 26 million of which are refugees. So look at the big number difference, 26, 80, 84. The rest of those people are internally displaced people, asylum seekers, and then we don't even know the official number of migrants. Why? Because like I said, there's no definition, they're voluntary, so no one's really counting them, right? But IOM roughly says it's about 225 million people. So certainly people are being pushed to and also pulled into moving, but not necessarily into better circumstances. And I'd be remiss in not mentioning that it is those with a little bit of means that are able to even move. The people who are even more alarmingly we should be concerned about are those who may be trapped in worse or untenable situations, who we might classify as trapped populations who don't have the means with which to move, and because migration costs a lot of money. So let me be very clear to say then that it doesn't mean that just because you can migrate you have money. It does mean that you are probably getting yourself into some very exploitative or extractive situations. So lastly, I'll just say that the countries that are historically and also currently the biggest emitters in the world certainly know that there's a connection between climate change and forced migration. And I think that's evidenced by the fact of very good work that writers and researchers are doing to look at border surveillance, border enforcement, border security, that tells us that, for example, if you took 7 of the biggest emitting countries, the ratio of money that they spend on shoring up their borders is over 2 to 1 compared to the money that they spend on climate finance, which is supposed to be the money that you're helping countries adapt to and build their resilience to the impacts of climate change. They pledged $100 billion a year. The richest countries in the world have not met that pledge, even though there's an international legal principle that says the richest countries in the world have a common but differentiated responsibility to do so. They haven't met that. They are still woefully behind, and yet you can see it's not a question of money and economies and metrics. It's a question of where do they want to spend the money. They're spending the money on shoring up their borders rather than helping countries withstand the impacts of climate change. So lastly, I'll say nobody wants to be forced to leave their home. Nobody is coming looking for jobs that they don't even actually get when they arrive in countries that are actually saying everything, you know, that are actually saying, please go away, right? So this is kind of the way in which it looks, and where the solutions are and where the hope and resilience are actually in the global south and in the frontline countries that Salote talked to you about, that you heard Noella describe, Bangladesh, Marshall Islands, Morocco. I could mention so many very hopeful and resilient stories that I'd be very happy to get into in the discussion section. Thank you so much.
Thank you for an absolutely excellent presentation. I asked people to please put their questions in the Q&A. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A, and you can write your questions there. I have 2 already, and I guess it could be to any of our speakers, but I have a feeling a lot of this is going to come to you, Amali, because you're the expert in a lot of the legal stuff. The first question really applies to US law, which is this Article 42 that a lot of lot of people are talking about right now. So the question is, what are the international legal agreements that should inform our policy with regards to repealing Article 42 regarding immigration in the U.S. at the U.S. southern border?
Yeah, I'd be happy to answer that. And in fact, I was going to mention it, but I forgot to look at how much time I had already been speaking. So Title 42 is actually supposed to be lifted on May 23rd. Inshallah, that'll happen. Now, Title 42 is 2 years for the purposes of everybody. Title 42 is a public decree, which is technically a public health decree, but when it went into effect at the start of the pandemic, saying that because of COVID, the borders were closed to anybody coming to the US southern border seeking asylum. So that meant a migrant, an asylum seeker, what have you, which is why you have people that were basically not told, there wasn't a hearing given, you weren't told, oh, your asylum case is denied, you were actually just told, try again. Now, this is actually even worse because then what it does is it allows people to keep kind of like continuously coming here, which puts you into these cycles of odious debt, and then also into more and more harmful, irregular pathways to keep trying to come to the US southern border. People have tried 50, 80, 100, 200 times. I mean, others have stayed at the US southern border in some of the worst humanitarian situations I've seen, and I've been to hundreds of refugee camps. And also in Reynosa, for example, across the border from Texas in McAllen is one of the more, most dangerous places in the world. So these are highly, highly dangerous, but also terrible humanitarian conditions. Now, with the Ukrainian situation, the US government, the Biden administration instructed the border officials to allow Ukrainians to come through and to sort of, well, certainly not to hold them to Title 42. That now has led to Title 42 supposedly being lifted on May 23rd. It remains to be seen whether they'll be able to process everybody, in time. There are also the migrant protection protocols where people have been sent to Mexico to await their asylum seeking. So we anticipate that it'll be quite messy, and we'll just have to see, Bruce. I hope I answered that question, but that is what Title 42 is, and that's where it stands right now.
Thank you very much. Another question we have is there any country in the world where migrants are being welcomed and assisted in creating a new life for themselves and their families? And Amali or Salote or Noella, if you want to, anybody can answer this. If I'm not sure there is such a country, but I would like to be proven wrong. Please.
Okay. Well, how about Colombia taking in all the Venezuelans? How about the fact that Bruce or someone, maybe you could Google me because I might be transposing this. I think it's Burundi who gave, or is it Tanzanians who gave Burundians full integration? There are some very good examples, very, very good stories of countries. The best, most holistic answer I can give you is there's what's called the Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement, which were written around in 1999, adopted by 2000. Internally displaced persons are essentially, they meet almost the same definition of a refugee, but they're still within their country. So it's sovereign states who have responsibility for them. But as you saw from those numbers I mentioned, we do have more IDPs than we do have even refugees. So countries might need, support in helping even their own IDPs, or IDPs may need support from their governments that they're actually still needing protection from but can't leave. The continent of Africa through what's called the Kampala Convention, actually adopted the guiding principles on internal displacement to be applicable to the entire continent. Meaning, if you are displaced from South Africa into Zimbabwe, you would have the sovereign rights that a South African would have in Zimbabwe. Now, because also the Banjul Charter and then also the African Union and all these other rights have a wider definition of public order that you might be fleeing in Africa. This also applies in Latin America. It's possible that in a climate context, you will actually have a greater amount of protection if you're displaced within the continent of Africa from border to border. So these are very good examples of people who are providing wider latitude, wider protections, wider humanitarian and legal, latitude, dignity, welcome. I mean, everything that we should all be aspiring to. And let me say lastly, that the entire continent of Africa, 54 nations, their collective carbon emissions is 3%.
One of the things I tell my class on refugees and migration is that the vast majority of migration is south-south. It is people migrating to countries in Africa or in South America or in Asia. We tend to have this feeling that everybody's migrating north to America or to Europe, and that's really not the case. It's mostly south-south, and it is the neighboring countries in Africa and South America and and in Asia that are far more welcoming than the countries are in the north, United States, Canada, and European countries. So I see you're nodding your head, so I guess you're agreeing with me on that.
86% of forcibly displaced people are hosted in developing countries. 86% of refugees as well.
Another question I have is, to what extent is the expectation of resilience among people facing climate crisis a form of blaming the victim? And Salote, do you want to chime in on this?
Yes, I was going to answer the previous question in addition to Amali's examples. In the Pacific, I'm sorry, my connection is blanking out a bit, so I apologize. I'm just going to use my voice. In the Pacific, there's regional discussions between countries about about just the expectation that volcanic islands, so Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, the bigger islands, creating space, creating land for the smaller atolls, so Tuvalu, Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, who are expected to lose a high percentage of land mass within the next 8 years, because 2030 is when more than 50% of the land masses are expected to be underwater. So those discussions are actively happening. There's discussions about purchasing land. There's discussions about just creating some labor mobility, which is already something that is an avenue for migration in the region. But those are some of the ways that regionalism, I guess, like in the example of that Amali provided for Africa, that is how it's showing up in the Pacific, about how countries can be more welcoming, can create sustainable livelihoods for those people who will need to relocate or migrate beyond their borders due to climate change. And to this question about the expectation of resilience, a form of blaming the victim. I'm not sure I understand the question, Ned. But let me take a stab at it. Yeah. I mean, I think in at least for the partners that we support, there's the physical resilience, right, of their infrastructure, of their homes, of seawalls and the infrastructure, and then there's the community resilience, the social capital that they're able to build and sustain over time through their indigenous identities, through their communities, to be able to sustain themselves if they do relocate to another community, if they're looking at migration and so forth. And I think it's been often used as a way of, okay, if you're able to do that throughout these years, perhaps you can do that to like sustain yourselves and continue to live where you are. And I think that narrative is often something that they have to continue to to listen to and hear. But I think that that is always perpetuated through like an uninformed, mostly Western media context. And I think that's why the language justice work that most of our partners are doing is very important. Yeah, I don't know if I answered that correctly.
I think it's a fine answer. I want to, and I'll go to Ned's next question, but I have a question of my own. As I understand the global compacts on refugees and the global compacts on migration, but particularly the global compact on refugees, is that there's an expectation that particularly when it's developing countries that are receiving migrants from neighboring states, that there will be money from the wealthy countries that will assist them in hosting their neighbors. And to the best of my knowledge, that isn't happening. Is that assumption correct? That's how I read the Global Compact on refugees.
Salote, do you know? I'm not entirely sure, Bruce, if it explicitly, I mean, I'm sure it does say that, you know, all member states pledge to support through humanitarian, right? Because of course, all of these things will have an ask and a call through the UN processes. But of course, like beyond the GCM, all of those things are voluntary anyway, right? I mean, UN member dues are, yes, they're written into the charter, but we all know that decades and decades and decades, the US hasn't paid its dues. So I don't know where it stands now, but right, like that's not uncommon. So this is the strength and weakness of the UN's entire, you know, architecture, if you will, is that it is based on the will of member states. So politics shape and shift that.
And UNHCR always comes up with asking for money and asking for pledges, and countries never pledge the amount of money that is needed. And then some countries actually pledge and then don't actually pay, which is pretty terrible too. So I would say the whole refugee migration system under the UN auspices is grossly underfunded. Is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely, incredibly grossly underfunded. I mean, so much so, you know, not just it's not just UNHCR, right? You have to also think about WFP, which of course goes hand in hand. Yes, there's bilateral aid and these bilateral aid countries that provide their own aid, but if anybody listening wants to Google right now, you'll see that WFP literally has to cut its own food rations. UNHCR cuts its food rations in certain countries, depending on, it's literally, you just have to kind of go, okay, wait, crisis brewing here. I got to take from Peter to pay Paul, because that's what this looks like. So much so that, I mean, you know, and then if you want to like follow that metaphor even further, you know, look at what's happening in Germany right now. Germany's literally asking Afghans to leave the shelters that they're in, that they've been occupying since the evacuations last summer, to make room for the Ukrainians coming in. You can't tell me there isn't enough space, but surely there is not enough, you know, desire to want to make space.
Thank you. That's depressing, but true. Yeah. also from here, we've got another question from another of our participants. There are different levels of welcoming, from running camps forever to allow people to work and go to school, but never able to become citizens. So yeah, some camps that are considered temporary, why, think of the Palestinians, they've been in refugee camps for decades. And then other people, like the Turks in Germany, for example, they're born there, they go to school there, they speak German fluently, and yet they're never considered citizens. So there's a lot of variation in how people are accepted and whether they're allowed to become citizens and what their status is within these countries. And maybe you could speak to that.
Were you talking to me, Bruce?
I guess, and anybody chime in. Noella, if you want to speak,
Please.
or Salote.
I mean, I think this question. Oh, sorry, Amali, were you unmuted?
No, please, Salote, go ahead.
I was gonna just say that in the Pacific, this question of becoming a citizen has been framed from a grassroots perspective of losing citizenship as you lose your identity to land because of the impacts of climate change. And do you also lose your indigeneity when you use land? Because for indigenous peoples, their connection to land and sea is different than than others. So the question about that has come up in so many discussions. It's deep. It's almost, for many communities, they're already mourning it. It's the loss is deep, and they recognize that no international policy or framework is going to address that. The regional discussions that have been happening, recognize that yes, we can give people, from Kiribati or Tuvalu who migrate to Fiji citizenship, but the loss that they will lose as Tuvaluans will not compensate for the loss that they will face as a people, as a unique group of people with a unique identity, with a culture that they've fought so hard to protect over the past millennia. And so that discussion has come up a number of times. I also want to mention, Amali mentioned, the importance of recognizing migrants in this dialogue. We also have partners in Haiti who have been. It's a new geographic region. Well, not really new, but we're working now in Haiti, who are also supporting migrants from the Dominican Republic, who were previously migrants from Haiti that have grown up in the Dominican Republic and now are back. And so their identity is dual, but who are now sort of at the borders, both physically, but also identity-wise. They are both Dominican and Haitian, but because of the political crisis, the uncertainty that's happening, but also because of the ongoing humanitarian disasters that happens in the region, they have also, brought up this issue of this dual identity and crisis that they're having as individuals. And that's really, these are uncharted waters and territory that we're living in, and it's only going to become more complex with time. And so I think as an institution that does this work, we really have to be positing ourselves in a learning sort of position, but also, not limiting ourselves to the policies that are already in place, and continue to question, what can be, because what we're hearing from our partners is just these provocative questions about what can be and what will this look like for our situation, because they're all new. And COVID is just creating a whole new wave of new things that we haven't even thought of. Sorry, I went on a rant.
Thank you. You can rant all you want. Noella, do you have any thoughts? I see you there. It looks like you're thinking, and maybe you have some thoughts about what we're talking about.
I don't exactly have any thoughts specifically on this, but yeah, I do think it's really important to think about, even when refugees are moving from even just like one place to another inside the same country, of how the cultures and traditions might still be changed, and they still might not feel like totally accepted, even if they're getting out of one bad situation because of the climate or because of other reasons. It might still not be the ideal situation, not being fully accepted into another place.
I want to ask a question about the concept of non-refoulement, which of course is a French word, and it's very much in kind of the legal jargon of refugee and migration law. And it's, if you come seeking refuge and you're coming seeking asylum, the country is not supposed to push you back. And we've had examples with Bangladesh pushing the Rohingya back into Myanmar. We have even at the US border with people coming to seek asylum, and we're making them stay in Mexico. There seems to be a lot of pushing people back, which it seems to me is not really legal in migration law. Is that a correct assumption?
Yeah, that is the principle of non-refoulement is the cornerstone of refugee law, but it is also it is a non-derogable law that is enshrined in international law, in international human rights law, in international refugee law. Whether it's codified in a treaty that you've acceded to or not, it is now international customary law. So doesn't matter whether you've signed, whether you signed and ratified the 51 convention, or it's also in various other conventions. So much so that, to bring it back to climate change, in several years ago, I think it was, well, a very long time, now a long time ago, well over 10 years ago, a man from Kiribati claimed asylum in New Zealand on the basis of climate change, and was denied and deported. And he then filed a petition, a complaint to the Human Rights Committee, the UN Human Rights Committee. And in January of 2020, they ruled that New Zealand, they of course can't rule on the deportation, but that New Zealand had not, violated his rights at this point, but that very soon to come, climate change does very likely pose a situation in which countries are obligated to not return people to countries in which they may face threats and harm to their person, a right to life, for example, because of situations that climate change then threaten. So rising seas in the case of Kiribati, could threaten this man's life and his right to a livelihood, his right to exist. And so let's say if he had thought, if he were to now do that today, I think it's quite possible that the Human Rights Committee would have said, well, actually, no, that deportation did violate his right to life, and therefore New Zealand would have been violating the principle of non-refoulement. So that Human Rights Committee ruling essentially upheld the principle of non-refoulement by saying countries are obligated not to return people to countries in which climate change poses a threat to their life. And that is exactly what the principle of non-refoulement is. So while that has always existed in context of the right to life, meaning this used to be, well, you shouldn't return people to situations where they may face imprisonment, torture, death, genocide. This is how we used to always kind of consider this. But of course, not only, right? Because under the right to life, I mean, you know, if I can't breathe, if I can't eke out a living, if I can't go to school, if I can't have full freedom of expression, right? I could make a case. I could make a case for the fact that that limits my ability to live out a whole life. So there's a lot of latitude here in being able to sort of like make a case under human rights law, but under human rights and climate change and environmental law, like this is where there's really a lot of hope in terms of legal aspects of what could come forward, Bruce, from human rights and environmental law, and also where this nexus of refugee law comes in with this principle of non-refoulement.
Yeah, that's kind of where I would like all of us to go next. And I'm thinking of Al Gore when he does his climate speeches. I heard him in Katowice, Poland, and COP24, and he gives you all the doom and gloom and all the reasons why the planet's going to blow up and we're all going to burn up. And then he ends up with hope. And he talks about renewable sources of energy are coming along-line and they're getting cheaper, and there really is hope that we can deal with this. What kind of hope can we have for climate forced displacement? Is there a hopeful silver lining that we can at least discuss or hope for in this talk, so that we don't end up on a complete downer? Salote, any hope there at UUSC?
Yes, the work that UUSC's partner do on an everyday basis, despite the many challenges they face, is inspiring to me personally, but you know, to UUSC as well. You know, one of our partners, I think Betsy mentioned that during the chat, Pacific Island students fighting for climate change, who gave the keynote at the for the UN Intergenerational Seminar on Sunday about their campaign to seek an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. That will impact not only all of our partners in the Pacific, but all the youths from around the world. And I think youths, their energy and the motivation that they have to save our planet, to save their homes is inspiring. It's radical. It's it really pushes us beyond the bounds of what we know and what we're able to do. And I think that gives me hope every day. So yeah, PIFs, go PIFs.
Noella, you went through a very difficult time in British Columbia, and so many people lost their lives and their homes. Do you see any hope? Do you see that the government of British Columbia, the government of Canada, do you see civil society coalescing to give you some hope for a brighter future?
Yeah, definitely. I want to say two things. First, I definitely think the more often that these kind of climate emergencies happen, the more prepared we are. As I was saying in my speech, I hope that next time it happens, we will have better coping strategies and be more prepared. And I think Amali and Salote were giving very good examples of, like, in general and really big things that we can be hopeful for. So obviously I don't have as much expertise in that area, so I want to offer a really hopeful story from my life. Was over the past year, or actually over the past few years, my family has been in contact with a refugee family, and this year was the year we were finally able to bring them to Vancouver, and it's been really, really hopeful to just be able to, like, see them start a new life here and have the kids. The kids are so excited. There's I think the oldest one is 7, and then all the other ones are younger. And it's very exciting to see them be so excited and have such joy to not live in a refugee camp. And that gives me a lot of hope, because I think sometimes when we're, like, talking about these things, it's easy to see, like, oh, the number of refugees or the number of whatever number as just a number, and not as individual people, individual families. So it's been very helpful to see that my family was able to bring this family to Canada, and hopefully we'll be able to bring more families. And I know that a lot of people are doing work like this, so it makes me really hopeful that there's going to be a lot of stories like this, hopefully.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. I know that's something that's been going on in Canada. I think they're talking about it here in the United States, I think in the UK. But this idea that family is actually helping refugee families and hosting them and helping them. Amali, do you have, I see you nodding, maybe you have something to add here as well.
Yeah, I actually, I mean, I get asked this question a lot, and it's kind of funny how I always have to write down what some of my thoughts are on that, because, you know, you go on with just do the work, and it drags you right back into, well, I guess some of the darkness of it all, but you wouldn't do it unless you did have the hope of something better, right? And that's actually tangible and achievable, and that there are microcosms of it everywhere, and that it's happening, because that's the only way you can keep, you know, it's the only way you're still going. Because I mean, human nature doesn't work that way. I know I can't be doing this still if some hopeful things weren't happening. So I know that sounds silly, but I really do have to sometimes, no matter how many times I'm asked that question, I have to kind of sit here and go, okay, yeah, so what are my hopeful things again? And think about it and write them down, because in 5 minutes from now, Bruce, I've got to like go do something that's like, okay, this is the reality. So that's the yin and yang of this, okay? But here's the hopeful things, right? Just, was it this year? Salote, you can chime in. I think, because time is crazy. I think it was this year. We have a resolution that now we have a special rapporteur on human rights and climate change in the UN. We passed a resolution after, oh my goodness, 20 plus years on the right to a healthy environment. We have emerging law, we have a definition that maybe, you know, we could have would that be the 5th law in the Rome Statute on ecocide, right? Which is international criminal law, which could hold corporations to account. We have this all happening while there are just a people's movement of young people, of migrants, of refugees, of frontline communities, of global South countries, of global South leaders using terminology, going to the UN Security Council and saying things like, this is an injustice, this is immoral. I mean, I listen to these speeches and I can't believe it, you know, okay, yes, they're politicians to some extent, but they're speaking with some impassioned frustration and some like moral agency to say, and using terms like climate refugees at the UN Security Council, that here's things that have to do with border disputes and, you know, things that fall under very like, you know, war, peace and security issues. So yes, we can go into the weeds about whether that's good or bad or not, but I think to me, it says a lot about people know that things aren't necessarily fair, and that they're tipped in ways that are just not acceptable anymore. And people are willing to just say, no more, or not in my name, and I want to fight back, and I want to say that, you know, I want to be informed, and I want to say that, you know, I'd like to join a movement that says, hey, how can we fight this back, as Noella was saying, right? So I think that these are like incredibly hopeful things. So when you have a special rapporteur that's saying, I'm going to start documenting what are the human rights losses that people are going through, where climate change is impacting them, that becomes like, you know, actual evidence that's going to become very hard to refute. Then you have, last year at COP26, this idea of loss and damage, which is we have an actual instrument, which has kind of sat dusty on a bookshelf for a while. We're now using it, and we're saying, hey, you know what? And by we, I mean, I'm talking about hundreds of UN member states going, we're saying this is a loss and a damage. And that's very sanitized ways of saying these are human rights losses. And we need to talk about it in those terms, because for you to say, oh, are you an economic migrant? Or is this about poverty? Or, well, hang on, what does climate have to do with it? Is just not, we're not gonna have these conversations anymore. So it's about elevating the conversation to things that really matter and not obfuscating the conversations. And I think that these are incredibly helpful things. Then I will say, when you look at what the Biden administration at the beginning of this year, are we in 20? So last year, beginning of last year, right? When the Biden administration said, it wanted to understand what impacts climate change and migration have. And then, you've got now the Canadian government looking, really exercising and speaking up about this. There are a lot of executive powers in both of these governments where, in the hands of the right people, you could do a lot of things to protect millions of people. A lot of regional instruments. I talked about Latin America, I talked about Africa, and these countries, these regions, they're getting on with finding ways to help their fellow citizens, not just their own. Colombia with Venezuela, look at those examples, right? UNHCR provided guidance last year on how the convention can apply in certain situations. Lastly, I'm gonna say, I think there's some really great things coming forth in terms of what is missing in the narratives and how can we fill it. And that's coming, I think, from people who are on the front lines of this, whether that be frontline communities, impacted people, migrants themselves. I hear from people who are in the most hardship conditions in refugee camps who don't even have the data with which to communicate with me. And they're saying, Amali, did you know that this happened in this camp? And I'm saying, how can we help you tell your story, So I think in this age of information, if you can try and connect those dots, and if we can try and say that's the type of information we want to create space for, that's incredibly hopeful to me.
Thank you. There's a note in the chat that I want to highlight. It's from Vita Eng, and she is the executive director of the Canadian Unitarian Council. And she says that Canadian citizens are able to sponsor refugees. It's a somewhat long process, and she gives a link for people to use. The Canadian Unitarian Council acts as an intermediary in matching refugees and sponsors. And she gives the website of the refugee@cuc.ca for people that are interested. And I know that some of our churches, both here in the United States and in Canada, have been centers where refugees could either stay or they are able to connect people that are willing to help refugees with. So what role do churches have, or can churches have to help with refugees?
I can speak on that a little bit, because the refugee family my family was sponsoring was we found them through our congregation, and I know a lot of congregations are sponsoring either through money or through helping with the process. And actually another hopeful story is, so one of the refugees we were sponsoring, I think their mother wanted to come to Canada, and I think only a few days or maybe a week, another church was able to fundraise all the money that we needed to start that process. So I know that there's a lot of community inside congregations that often has a lot of power to either fundraise or help with organizing. And I think there are a lot of people in those congregations who really do want to help people. So I think that's really inspiring to me.
I'm going to ask one last question, and it's kind of a personal question in a way. I'm a gay man, and I've been to Kakuma refugee camp, and actually I get emails from Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya all the time from LGBT refugees in Kakuma, and they are talking about how bad things are for them in that camp. And we have done some work in trying to help LGBT asylum seekers. We actually have been successful in getting them asylum. sometimes when, like I used to work for the Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration at the State Department, they kind of have standard ways, and they usually put arriving refugees into areas where people speak their language and have their customs. And for LGBT refugees, that's the wrong place to send them. Because I've had LGBT people say, you put me with my same people that I'm trying to get away from, and they're just as bigoted in Houston as they were in Baghdad. And why are you doing this to me? So I guess my question is related. There are refugees like LGBT refugees or people with disabilities, people that have special cases and special needs that often aren't really tended to. People don't see them as individuals, and they just kind of put everybody with one nationality together thinking that's going to solve the problem. And I'm wondering what thoughts that you might have on that.
Yeah, so, you know, I actually was the resettlement officer in Kakuma, Bruce, for a time, and did an expedited protection resettlement for LGBTQ Ugandan refugees. So I know exactly what you're talking about. Implemented that whole program, and yes, so had to dismantle the whole, okay, Ugandans they don't need to be with Ugandans because I needed to deal with the protection concerns. We'll have a side conversation about that. See, okay, so what ends up happening is the following. Because you're dealing with people all around the world in humanitarian emergencies, you know, there's a need to formalize structures, and that's necessary and that's helpful, because you do need these standard operating procedures. But in doing so, in the registration process, for example, when you have arrivals, you can, it's not necessarily the best time, because there can be some real chaos in those situations, to delineate protection concerns like you've just described. But that assessment is done, and it's quick, and but things that are more nuanced, things that aren't obvious or physical, may not always be captured. So, I mean, I can't tell you how much people can go years, and I have met people in like years and years into living in fact that same camp, and they're being resettled, and maybe it's their last US resettlement interview. So it's 10 years in, and you're finding out about a sexual violence situation that's been ongoing for 10, 15 years, you know. So things like this can happen, unfortunately, because you are dealing with 500,000 people living in a camp. But there are obviously protection and you know, women's protection and various different types of needs that are always met, and assessments that are always ongoing, and those things are attended to, so that it isn't as simple as you just described, where Somalis go with Somalis, and, you know, even at the minuscule level of ethnicities, where you just put people who speak the same language together. But even if you do put people, make an assessment about their specific needs, and you make housing or you know, recommendations based on that, people will also tend to live within the confines and the situations, you know, they'll create their own, because after a while, you know, you go from living in temporary situations to generations living this way. So you mentioned the Palestinians, for example, right? I mean, at this point, what do you do about the fact that it's 75 plus years, right? I mean, there aren't really protection concerns going, you know, being assessed on a daily basis in these cases. So these are the realities, you know, and it can be very, very difficult. But I can tell you that, you know, it's certainly not something that's overlooked. It's something that there are professionals that this is their entire job, to always have their eyes and ears to the ground, and have those conversations with populations to ask them in confidence what their needs are, and also advise in complete confidentiality. Yeah.
Well, we're actually coming pretty much to the end of our time. There are other questions. There's somebody who's already put in the question that the hopeful things that you just mentioned, or if they're written down, we'd like to get a copy of them. Of course, this has been recorded, so we can also go back to the recording and hear them. I'm just one thing that I feel that I need to bring up, and then I want to give each one of you a chance to say a final word. The Ukrainian situation is, of course, top of mind. There's some 5 million refugees coming out of Ukraine. There's an awful lot of sympathy for the terrible situation they're going through. Some receiving countries like Poland, the mayor of Warsaw has already said, we have enough already, we can't take any more. So, there's that situation going on. Something that's also been talked about, there are such people as Afro-Ukrainians. There are people that through mixed marriages or whatever have dark skins. There are also quite a few students from South Asia and Africa that are not getting the same treatment as the white Ukrainians. And that's disturbing. So I'll give all three of you a chance to give a final statement. And if you want to address those issues about Ukraine, please do so. And I don't know which order to go in. We'll start with Salote. We'll start in the same order as we did with the speakers. So Salote, final words and thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce, for having me. I really appreciated being here. My final reflections, there's so many thoughts and afterthoughts. I want to, share some of the wisdom that our partners have always reminded me about around particularly language justice when describing the experiences that they face, and particularly when it comes to advocating for them and with them, and that it's important to always remember that one day we will not be here, that future generations will live the words that we've shared. I don't have the writing in front of me. That's why I'm trying to remember from my memory. The future generations, that our children and our grandchildren will remember the words that we speak. This recording will be heard by them. That they will rewatch and reread what we shared. So it's always important for us to lift ourselves up, and to remember the value of, or the worth, our worth, and the value of our connection with each other and with Mother Earth, despite the many differences and the many challenges that we face. And I know that's kind of hard to imagine sometimes and to think about, especially as we're losing so much of what we rely on for our daily lives. But that is the spirit that I want to live this panel with. Thank you again, Bruce, for having me.
Thank you, Salote. Noella, last words, final words.
Yeah, I also just wanted to say thank you, Bruce, for having me. And thank you to Salote and Amali for being on this panel with me. It's been really great. And let me think if there's anything else I want to say. Just this has made me really hopeful to hear about the work that you guys are doing. I'm really hoping for a good future. Thank you.
Thank you, Noella. I think we can have a good future as long as we all help each other. Hamila.
Yeah, I will say that it's been a real honor to share this time with you all. Thank you very much, Noella, Salote, and Bruce. And I'm glad you brought up that question as well, Bruce, because I do think that everything we've said, and the limitations in protection and the limitations in border policy and what countries are willing to support and not support, who they'll support and who they won't support, and the disproportionate ways in which they're doing that is, I think, evidence of a problem we do have to confront just as much equally, which is this problem of racism. Even the sheer fact of what I said about, why don't we have a governance framework for migrants? If we had 200 plus million migrants who are different, coming from different countries and different colors, and demonstrated a very different power dynamic, would the laws be different? The sheer fact is the dynamics of displacement have changed, but the architecture and the power brokers who would like to keep things the way they are, the status quo the way they are, and that is this dependency on fossil fuels and a few countries that just want to keep everything the way it is just completely unsustainable, and the planet is telling us that, right? The fact that you have, you mentioned Poland, you have one border open to Ukrainians and you have the other border simultaneously closed to Afghans, to Eritreans, to Ethiopians, to Syrians, etc. Within the Poland right now as well, and I'm not just picking on Poland, we could mention any country. Last numbers I have were, it's probably more now, 56 African refugees are in detention cells, whereas, which are jails, and we all know how the entire continent of Europe has been, we've also talked about sponsorship and families opening their homes to Ukrainians. What we're seeing in terms of Ukrainian response is what we have all advocated for our entire lives. I could not welcome that response anymore. I just simply ask us all to think about a fundamental question of why is it so unequal and what must we do to change that? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I also want to thank all of our participants for being here, for your attention. This is very important things that we're talking about. We're talking about people, their lives. We're talking about the sustainability of our planet. And somebody has written here, hope is not something you wish, it's something you do. And so we all need to get to doing things to save our planet and to help each other, all the people in the world that need help, regardless of what they look like, where they come from, what their religion is, their ethnicity, anything. They're all people and we need to help each other. And we can get through this crisis if we do that. If we don't, then it's pretty sad. But I want to end on the hopeful note. And again, thank you all for being here. Thanks for your attention. And please enjoy the rest of the seminar. We have more workshops and other events coming up, but we will end it here. And thanks for your attention. And thanks to our speakers. And thanks to the planning committee, and particularly Amanda Newlove and Rob Kipp, who have done so much today to help put this together. Thank you.